Hey folks, now over the last week or so I've been playing around with this, Nvidia's new budget offering, the Turing-based GTX 1650, and it's been a really long time coming, headed on for 2.5 years since Nvidia last released a 50 series card with the GTX 1050 and the 1050 Ti. So I was pretty disappointed that before it launched, listings had started cropping up on Amazon at well over the £100 mark, even more so on launch day when everyone's fears were confirmed and many were being listed at £160, with the cheapest single fan variants still being around £140. To put that into perspective, at launch I managed to snag a dual fanned GTX 1050 Ti for around £135. The same version of the GTX 1050 would have cost me about £25 less. With this generation, the cheapest single fan version of the non-Ti 1650 costs more than the previous generation 1050 Ti. An update 2.5 years later with a 30% price hike is something that I'm sure many of you is going to find hard to swallow, especially now when the GTX 1050 Ti can be had for under 3 figures on the used market, making the price difference more like 50% in a lot of cases. Worse than that is the fact that Nvidia has still not addressed the biggest gripe that many had with the older 1050 Ti, its competitiveness with the RX 570. Now we all know at this stage that the RX 570 is just a slight refresh of the RX 470, a 3-year-old GPU, and one that if you check back on many videos, mine included, was touted as a better performer and a better choice than the 1050 Ti back then. Back then, the argument of 10% more cost for 30% more performance, it was justifiably thrown around. Now though, the RX 570 comes in at around 120 to 125 quid here in the UK and is still faster than even this newer Turing based card. The RX 570 proposition has changed from being much faster for a few more quid to still being faster for around 10% less. But looking back through the comments on my coverage of the 1050 Ti, there was one constant theme of those who championed that card. This card is for those who simply want to upgrade an old Dell or HP, or it's perfect for those who don't have a good power supply, and of course it's the fastest card which doesn't need a power connector. You get the gist. And it's going to be the same with the 1650. On paper it does eclipse the GTX 1050 Ti, and technically now it is the fastest graphics card out there which doesn't need supplemental power. But I wanted to check something out, this mysterious use case of turning an old HP or Dell into a gaming PC, and I've found this. Heading for a scrapyard from a local business, this poor HP system had been sat in a box unused from the day it was bought. An old but completely new HP Pro desktop. Sure, its specs are really nothing to write home about. I mean, with a 300 watt power supply, no external PCI connectors, a 320GB mechanical hard drive, and a dual core i3 550 processor with a whopping 2GB of DDR3 memory. But it cost me absolutely nothing, and looking online you could probably pick a similar system up for about 50 quid. But of course, if we're going to use this system, we're first going to have to make it usable. Thankfully, early core CPUs, they're now pretty cheap, so we're going to begin our upgrade journey with the following. A Core i5 750, that's 4 cores, 4 threads, with a 3.2 GHz boost for around 15 quid, 8GB of paired DDR3 memory in a 2x4 configuration, which costs under 25 quid, and a new 120GB SSD which we're going to migrate the OS to over after we update from Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10 Pro. This is a PNY drive which was bought new on eBay for about 17 quid. So with the new parts installed, the OS updated to Windows 10 and migrated over, I guess we're ready to test out the 1650 in what is touted as its ideal use case. And to test it, it would only be fair to pit it against the previous crown holder, my own GTX 1050 Ti. So to do this we're going to be using Shadow of the Tomb Raider as a measurement of how the cards perform, simply because it's a fairly good indicator of in-game performance in a new DX12 title. But more importantly, it lets us see in great depth fairly easily how and when the system gets bottlenecked. So kicking things off with the GTX 1050 Ti, something immediately sprung out to me. Now at 1080p on my Ryzen system at the high preset, we would pretty much be 100% GPU bound. But here we can see that while we still get an average frame rate and percentile lows above 30 FPS, it's only GPU bound for 86% of the time. Now running through the rest of the presets, we get a nice 10% boost going to medium, and just under 20% boost from that going to low, but the GPU bound percentage plummets to 62, showing that in an older quad-core i5 will struggle to keep even a GTX 1050 Ti fed. So I guess there's no real hope for the 1650 then, and sure enough that's reflected in the GPU utilisation numbers. We do see a nice bump in average FPS with the GTX 1650, with the medium preset feeling very similar to the 1050 Ti on the low preset. But even at high, the GTX 1650 is only GPU bound for 58% of the time, while at low the system is only constrained by the GPU for 14% of the time. Absolutely not what you'd want to see if you've just splurged 150 quid to transform an OEM system. So let's go back to the drawing board, as it seems like the day of the quad-core CPU is definitely dead, thanks to the advent of more powerful low-end hardware like the 1650. So out comes the Core i5 quad-core, and in with an i7 870, no, not an 8700, an 870. A 4-core 8-threaded part which can boost up to 3.6 GHz, and have added another 8GB of DDR3 memory for good measure. Now even though these i7 CPUs are old, they still cost between 35 and 40 quid. And we can add another £25 onto that total for the two 4GB DDR3 sticks. All things which diminish the idea that all you need to do is plonk in a 75W GPU into any old desktop and that's you ready to roll. But I will say that in the second iteration of the HP desktop with 8 threads, the GTX 1050 Ti is no longer CPU bound at high and medium settings, and still manages a very respectable 90% at the low preset. Interestingly, we'll also see a bump in the average and minimums here, thanks to that newfound headroom. An increase of between 2.5% and 6% depending on the settings, and a larger bump on the percentile lows. Sure, this only translates to a couple of frames here and there, but when you're only targeting 30 FPS, every little helps. The 1650 however sees an even better boost in performance than the 1050 Ti did, with averages increasing between 9 and 11%, which is nothing to be snuffed at. The lows here are also increased by around 5%, while at the same time dramatically increasing the amount of time that the benchmark is GPU bound. A maximum of 90% on high, to twice as much as we've previously seen when using the i5 on the low preset. But we can kind of see a pattern emerge here. It's clear that the whole GTX 1650 and an older desktop argument is starting to fall apart. On an older system, the small gap between a 1050 Ti and a 1650 closes even further than you would see with a new system, forcing you to spend more money on higher end older components. Now for sure we could go for something newer like a Haswell system, like the CPU I used to use, the i5 4590 for example, but we've got to remember that when AMD released Ryzen, it really shook up the CPU market, and now those same disruptive low end parts are finding their way onto the used market at rock bottom prices. Ryzen 3 systems for example often undercutting newer older generation i5 desktops. And since those systems will not be built by your traditional Dells or HPs, they're going to be using standard off-the-shelf power supplies, meaning that the likelihood of you getting at least one 6 or 8 pin PCI power connector is pretty high, which in turn opens you up to a whole host of other graphics cards. If you want to stick new, you've got an RX 570 at £120, and used cards like an RX 580 or GTX 1060 can often be had for just a smidge over £100. In short, if you're spending any more than say £150 or £200 or so on a base system, chances are you're going to find one which is not going to restrict you to a 75W graphics card like the GTX 1650. And when we remove this use case, the value proposition of the 1650, it just completely falls apart. So Nvidia has completely messed up the launch of the 1650 in my opinion then. It's too little, it's too late, and it's too expensive, which is a real shame, as it's actually a really nice little card. And if this card had came out about the same price as the 1050 did 2.5 years ago, it would be a lot more appealing. But as it stands now, with used GTX 1050 Ti's sneaking under 3 figures, the 50% increase in price for even the lowest end GTX 1650, it just doesn't make any sense. And you would have to be absolutely bonkers to buy one of the higher end 1650s, especially those cards that require a 6-pin PCI power connector. But hey, there must be some use for this card. I'm going to keep trying to hunt it down. At the end of the day, it is the fastest 75 watt GPU you can buy, but like I said, I'm going to keep hunting for use cases for this card, and we'll probably run through a full benchmark suite in the near future. So if you've got any ideas of what I should be using it for, then I'd love to hear it. And I'd also love to hear if you want to see more of this cheap and cheerful HP desktop. In all honesty, the desktop itself, once you've got an i7 in it with a decent amount of RAM, it's actually not too bad to use. But that's it for today folks, I'm going to leave it there. And I'll just say take care, and I'll see you all in the comment section down below, and in the next video.